In a
think
world
this
of
is a
power,
joke?
secrets,
You
and
think I
betrayal,
wanted this? You
one
ruined
moment
my
changes
life.
everything. At 30 weeks pregnant,
wait,
Claire
please
believed she was
don't.
building a future, until one shocking act shattered the illusion. Behind the polished image of a perfect marriage lay lies, manipulation, and a carefully orchestrated
You're
betrayal
finally
that had
here.
been unfolding for years.
I was so worried.
But when Claire finally
okay
uncovers
now,
the
Dad.
truth, she doesn't
We
break,
both are.
she rises. And what follows isn't just the fall of a man, it's the collapse of an empire and the rebirth of a woman who refuses to be silenced.
Please,
This
just give me
story
5
reminds us,
minutes. I didn't know where else to
sometimes
go.
the hardest truth to accept
said it's
is the
over,
one we've
James. You
always
need to
known
leave.
deep down. Ignoring red flags doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the moment they change everything. Walking away isn't weakness, it's courage. And choosing yourself may be the most powerful decision you ever make. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt real to your own journey, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
At 30 weeks pregnant, she was propped up in a hospital bed, a thin monitor strap across her belly, watching the tiny flicker of her son's heartbeat trace across a screen. 152, 152, 152. Her husband entered the room. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't glance at the monitor. He demanded to know who she'd spoken to at a tech journal, a leak about his company. She told him the truth. He called her a liar. And then the strike came, from the right, a crack of sound, sharp and sudden, an open palm against a woman's cheek in the quiet of a maternity ward, the one place she was meant to be safe. She sat still, her hand rising slowly to the sting on her face. The monitor continued its steady count, 152, 152, the heartbeat of her unborn son, rhythmic and oblivious. Her husband smoothed the front of his designer jacket and walked out. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone. She sent a text to her father, just 3 words. He did it. What transpired over the next 48 hours didn't just dissolve a marriage, it fractured a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. Because the man who struck his pregnant wife in a hospital room had forgotten one thing, one pivotal, devastating detail. Her father was waiting for a single reason to reclaim what was his. And now he had it. Stay with Eliza. Because what she uncovers about the 2 years leading up to that strike is infinitely more shattering than the blow itself. And the world she builds from the ashes is the part of the story you will never forget. Before we go on, this story is for every woman who has ever dimmed her own light to let someone else shine brighter, who has ever rationalized away the warning signs, who has ever held out hope for a version of a person to return that maybe never existed in the first place. This story is evidence that losing a life that was wrong for you is not a defeat, it is a foundation. If this story resonates with you, if a single moment feels like something you have endured or seen or held in silence, please like this video and leave a comment. Tell us which part you felt the most. Your stories connect with other women who need to know they are not isolated. Share this with someone who needs this message today. And if you are new to this community, subscribe and stay. Every story we tell here is for women who are ready to break the silence on the things that truly matter. You are precisely why we are here. The fetal monitor chirped, a rhythm steady and serene. It was indifferent to the drama unfolding in Room 7B of the Seattle Cascade Medical Center. It just kept count, 152, 152, 152. Eliza Vance was 30 weeks pregnant. She lay in a hospital bed, the blue paper gown rustling with every small movement. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy bun, and dark circles shadowed her eyes from 3 days of a preterm labor scare, stress-induced contractions, and the deep cellular weariness of a body building another human from scratch. The nurses on the maternity floor had been wonderful. They knew her name without glancing at her chart and brought her extra blankets when the Seattle rain chilled the room. A nurse named Anya had sat with her for 20 minutes the night before, saying nothing, just offering a quiet presence, while the machines did their work. The fluorescent light overhead was less compassionate. It hummed with a low buzz, casting a sterile, clinical glare on everything. Eliza was staring at the monitor, the one tracking her son's heart. 152 beats per minute. Strong, steady, and completely unconcerned with anything else. She'd been watching it for half an hour when the door swung open. Marcus Thorne walked in. He was 41, 6'1", dressed in the Seattle Tech Baron uniform, a ridiculously expensive black hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers that probably cost more than her hospital stay. His watch face glowed with notifications. He had come straight from his office downtown. He hadn't paused to shift his mindset or arrange his features into a look of concern. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the baby. He placed his phone face down on the rolling table and gave the medical equipment a dismissive look. His glance was quick, assessing. "Who did you talk to at TechCrunch?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, an opening statement that already knew its conclusion. Eliza just looked at him. "Marcus," she said, her voice strained, "my contractions started again. The doctor thinks I know why you're here," he cut in. "I'm asking who you leaked the Helios update details to. Isabel said one of your old junior designers mentioned you were raising hell about it. I didn't leak anything, and Isabel is wrong." The atmosphere in the room went cold. Not a sudden drop, but a slow, creeping chill. It was the kind of pressure change that signals a storm front moving in. Marcus stared at her. "Do not call my lead project manager wrong," he said, his voice dangerously low. It was the tone he used when he was done debating, the quiet that was more menacing than any shout because it meant he had already passed judgment. "Marcus, I designed the original safety architecture. I know that—" She stopped. He glanced at the monitor, at the number, 152. Then his eyes came back to her, and they held an expression she had spent 4 years learning to decode. It was the look that meant he was running a risk analysis, calculating variables, deciding on the most effective way to control the situation. "You made me look weak," he said. "You went into the team's private channel yesterday from your phone and questioned my final call on the Helios launch. That was out of line. The launch build removes the ethical filters. I was correcting a catastrophic error." "You were not asked to correct anything. You're on leave. You logged in from a hospital bed and undermined my entire team in front of our investors who monitor that channel. Because they were about to approve a feature that could get us sued into oblivion. That is not your call to make anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with everything left unsaid. Eliza stared at the monitor. 152, 152. She took a breath. "You're right," she whispered, and a piece of her fractured as she said it. "I should have called you first. I'm sorry." She watched his face, waiting for the familiar recalibration, the slight easing of his jaw that meant the storm had passed. This was the dance. She conceded. He accepted. The tension would recede. The world would keep turning. Only this time, the dance was different. "The board is asking questions," he said, "about your stability, about your judgment. They're concerned that having you consult on product safety while you're in this state is a liability." "This state?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, I am 30 weeks pregnant with our son. It's not a state, it's—" "I am trying to make you understand," he said, and his voice sank into its lowest register, the one that signaled the conversation was irrevocably over, as far as he was concerned, "that your emotional behavior is creating problems that I have to clean up on top of everything else I am dealing with right now." She thought, "I should be quiet. I should just let it go. Wait until he's not angry." She had told herself that 1,000 times. She told herself that again, right now, from a hospital bed, 30 weeks pregnant, with a baby whose safety depended on her staying calm. but then her eyes fell on his phone. The screen lit up with a notification. A text from Isabel. The preview read, "Don't worry about E. We'll handle her." E. That's what they called her. She said, "Isabel is reckless with our users' safety, and you're letting her." The slap came from the right side. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't even a shove. It was the flat, open palm of his hand, moving with shocking speed, connecting with her right cheek. The sound was a horrible, flat crack, a noise that didn't belong in a room with a fetal heart monitor. It wasn't a blow meant to cause injury. It was a blow meant to stop a conversation, to assert control, to end an argument. For 3 heartbeats, the world stopped. The monitor didn't. 152, 152, 152. Eliza's hand rose to her own face slowly, as if her mind couldn't quite catch up to what her body had just felt. Her fingers pressed against the blooming heat on her skin, testing if it was real. It was. In the silence that followed, Marcus stood by the door, adjusting the sleeve of his hoodie. He pulled at the cuff with the same intense, meticulous focus he applied to lines of code, a quick, precise tug to make it sit perfectly. The door opened. Anya, the nurse, came in holding a blood pressure cuff and a tablet. She was 29 and had been working in maternity wards for 6 years. She had seen families at their best and their worst. She had an almost supernatural ability to instantly read the emotional temperature of a room. She read this one. Her face did something remarkable. It went completely blank for a split second, a total freeze, followed by a professional recalibration so swift it was almost imperceptible. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice perfectly level. "I need to check Mrs. Vance's vitals now." Marcus glanced at the nurse, then back at Eliza. He grabbed his phone from the table, not looking at her again. He shoved it into his pocket. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and left. His expensive sneakers made no sound on the polished floor. The door clicked shut. Anya was at the bedside in 3 steps. She didn't speak. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her movements efficient and gentle as she wrapped the cuff around Eliza's arm. She hit the start button and waited. The machine whirred, then beeped. 180 over 110. Anya looked at the numbers. She looked at the red mark on Eliza's cheek. She put the tablet down. She asked, very softly, "Is there someone you need me to call?" Eliza stared at the wall. The light hummed. The monitor counted. The baby gave a slow, rolling kick inside her, a movement of comfort, of a child who had no idea the world outside his own had just been torn apart. Eliza thought, I knew on some level it would come to this. She thought, I just never imagined it would be here. She thought, I am 30 weeks pregnant, in a hospital bed, and my husband just hit me and walked away to fix his sleeve. She looked at Anya. Call my father, she said, her voice clear and cold. Jonathan Vance. Tell him Marcus just invoked Clause 7. Robert Sterling had sculpted the San Francisco skyline, transforming Sterling Properties from a local construction outfit into the dominant real estate development force on the West Coast. He'd achieved this over 30 years with an instinct for undervalued land, relentless negotiation, and the courage to break ground when everyone else was running for cover. He was reviewing architectural plans in his Embarcadero office 3 miles from his daughter's penthouse when his private line buzzed with her name. He answered before the first ring finished. Amelia said 3 words. Dad, it's true. Robert Sterling said, I'm on my way. He was already moving. He dropped the call, placed the phone in his jacket pocket, gave a sharp nod to his chief architect, and strode out of the presentation without a word. He bypassed the elevator for the fire stairs. He hit the curb just as his driver pulled up, sensing the urgency in his employer's gait. 3 miles, 9 minutes. He arrived, his tie still perfectly knotted, his tortoiseshell reading glasses perched on his head where he'd pushed them hours ago. He used his own key to enter the penthouse on the 52nd floor and stopped. He saw his daughter's face, the blotchy redness around her eyes. Her hand was resting on the swell of her belly, a protective, reflexive gesture. He recognized the look in her eyes, the brittle composure of someone holding their world together with nothing but sheer willpower. He crossed the living room in 4 long strides. He sat on the velvet ottoman beside her chaise lounge. He took her free hand in both of his. His hands were calloused and warm. She remembered being 7 years old, utterly convinced that no monster could ever get her as long as her father was holding her hand. She was not 7 years old, but she squeezed back. "Talk to me," he said, his voice quiet, the specific quiet that takes a Herculean effort to maintain. It was the calm of a man who knew his daughter needed an anchor, and so an anchor he would become, no matter the storm raging inside him. She told him about the photograph, the late-night work calls, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jacket last week, the 3 seconds of cold silence when she'd asked who it was. Her hand going instinctively to her belly when she finished speaking. Robert was still. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock. "Have you suspected this before?" Robert asked. Amelia's silence was the only answer he needed. "Not like this," she whispered. She was still staring at the tablet on the coffee table, at the damning photo. "Not confirmed. It was always other things." Robert didn't press. He waited with the patience of a man who had spent 61 years learning that the truth rarely surfaces on demand. And then it came. Not chronologically, not as a neat summary, but as a torrent. The kind of torrent that erupts when a hairline crack in a dam that's been holding for years finally shatters, and everything that was held back surges forth without any thought for order or grace. The tablet, first year of their marriage, he had been so secretive with it, angling the screen away from her, closing it shut if she walked into the room. One night, she had woken up around 2 a.m, thirsty, and saw the glow from the living room. Leo was on the couch, illuminated by the screen, swiping through profiles on a private social app with the detached, methodical precision of an analyst reviewing data. He had looked up and seen her. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't ashamed. He had simply met her gaze with that cool, appraising stare and said, "Just networking. You know how it is in the valley." As if it were a business seminar, as if she were a fool. She hadn't known what to argue against, so she had said nothing. The silence had settled over the incident, heavy and suffocating, and they had gone back to bed. In the morning, it was as if it had never happened. She had convinced herself it was ambition, the relentless drive that made him successful. She had told herself she saw the pressure he was under in a way no one else did. She had believed that understanding someone's ambition was the same as supporting it, and that support was the foundation of love. She had been wrong on all 3 counts. The gala. 2 years in, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art benefit, 150 people under a canopy of shimmering lights. The main course was being served. She'd made an observation about a new impressionist acquisition, her field of expertise, the career she had adored before she stepped back to manage their philanthropic endeavors at Leo's insistent suggestion. It had been presented as a partnership, an elevation, but now felt like a gilded cage. She'd made a witty, insightful point. Leo had laughed, not a quick private laugh, a performative, turn-to-the-table laugh designed for an audience. He had patted her hand and said, "Amelia has her little hobbies," and then had seamlessly pivoted the conversation to his company's latest funding round, as if she were a child who had just recited a poem. 150 people at the surrounding tables. She had smiled. She had picked up her water glass. She had not mentioned art again that night. She had barely spoken at all. The pregnancy announcement. She had arranged a tiny pair of designer sneakers on his pillow with a simple, handwritten card. "Get ready for our next big venture." She had rehearsed the moment for a week, buzzing with that happy, hopeful anxiety that comes from planning the perfect gift. He had come home late. He had read the card. He had looked at her. He had said, "I hope you can still travel for the Singapore launch." Then he kissed her on the forehead and went to his office to take a call. She had stayed in the bedroom for a long time after, the tiny shoes still on the pillow. She had manufactured an entire narrative. He shows love through providing. He's just focused on our future. I'm being overly emotional because of the hormones. He loves me. He just has a different way of showing it. She had built a fortress of excuses and had lived inside it, refusing to look at the crumbling shoreline she had left behind. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Robert waited. "I think I knew. I think deep down, I always knew something was fundamentally broken." She paused. "I just kept waiting for the man I thought I married to show up." Robert said, "Was he ever really that man?" The question landed with the weight of an anchor in the silent room. The ripples spread out, and she knew they would never stop. She did not answer right away, because the true answer, the one she was seeing clearly for the first time, was this: she had no idea. She had been so busy waiting for a man to return that she'd never stopped to confirm if he had ever existed in the first place. "God, I was such an idiot," she whispered, the thought finally spoken aloud. All the signs were right there. Robert didn't say she wasn't an idiot. He was too smart and too direct to offer a flimsy comfort that she would only have to argue against, which would be its own form of exhaustion. He just held her hand. Outside the penthouse, down in the lobby, Maya Singh was getting out of a cab. She was completing a final text to a client, a motion she was filing first thing in the morning. As a senior litigator, she was meticulous. She noted the time, 3:37 in the afternoon. She noted the frantic tone in the single text message she'd received from Robert Sterling. "Come to the penthouse. Amelia needs you." She noted the security guard in the lobby, the way his eyes tracked her as she headed for the private elevator. She knew this building. She had helped Robert's legal team review the purchase contracts years ago. The one with security protocols she herself had recommended. A system that recorded every entry and exit from the private elevator, date and time stamped. She flagged the thought for later. She pressed the button for the penthouse. She stood for a moment, her hand resting on her leather briefcase. Then the doors opened, and she went up to her friend because that was what you did, and because the small, methodical steps you take in the beginning are always the ones that matter most in the end. Maya arrived 43 minutes after Robert. She was 31 years old, quick-witted, ferociously loyal, and approached legal battles the way she approached the Bay Bridge at rush hour, with aggressive, calculated confidence and a total disregard for the timid. She had gotten the text from Robert while in a deposition. The text had contained 6 words. She came through the penthouse door and stopped. She looked at Amelia's tear-stained face, at the rigid, careful posture Amelia was using to hold herself together, at the way Amelia held her body on the chaise lounge perfectly still, as if any movement would cause everything to shatter. Maya put her briefcase down. She said, her voice dangerously low, "I've been holding my tongue for 4 years." Amelia looked up at her. "I know. I'm not holding it any longer. I know that, too." Maya sat down on the edge of the chaise, not on a chair, but right there on the chaise itself, the way she had sat on Amelia's twin bed at Stanford 13 years ago, when they were 19 and the world was a place where things like this happened to other people. She didn't hug her right away. She just sat there, solid, present, an undeniable fact. After a moment, Amelia leaned her head against Maya's shoulder. The clock in the hall chimed 4 o'clock. On the balcony, Robert stepped away from the door. He pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart. The call was answered on the first ring. David, Robert said. His voice had changed. It wasn't louder. It was heavier, like steel being compressed. Harder, more absolute. Clear your calendar. I need you at my office now. 4th floor conference room. And when you come, bring the Sterling Vaughn prenuptial agreement. The entire file. All of it. David Chen, his lawyer, asked, "How bad is it?" "He broke my daughter's heart in her own home. She is 32 weeks pregnant." A silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, David said. "And Robert?" "Yes." "I'll call my contact at the Chronicle's business desk, just in case." Robert let out a slow breath. The exhale was a mixture of grief and ice-cold resolution. "Thank you," he said. He ended the call. He stood on the penthouse balcony, the sounds of the city he had built rising around him, the distant clang of a cable car, the cry of a gull, all of it fading into the background of a singular, unshakable purpose. Distant sounds echoed down the corridor, the first cry of a newborn announcing itself to the world, and he gave himself 1 minute. He let himself feel the rage he knew he could not show his daughter. Then he packed it away, smoothed the lapels of his jacket, and went back inside. Evelyn Reed arrived in under 20 minutes. She was 63 years old, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had navigated 4 decades of Seattle's most bitter corporate divorces and learned that the softest voice in the room often held the most power. She set her leather-trimmed tablet case on the windowsill and placed a slim file next to it. She met Marcus with a look that communicated a shared grim understanding. She turned to Ilara with the gentle, direct compassion of someone who had known her since she was a girl and had no intention of pretending this was just another Tuesday. She didn't open the file right away. "Before I show you this," she said, "I need to confirm what you told your father on the phone." Marcus had called her an hour ago, his voice tight after Ilara had told him what she'd found the night before. She had done it quietly, not wanting to worry Julian. She'd mentioned at a dinner party weeks ago, as a joke almost, that he was getting so secretive about his new project files. He'd laughed it off, saying it was a surprise, something he described as a legacy proposal. She had said it once and let it go. Her father had not. Last night, unable to sleep, she'd been searching the firm's server for old photos for a baby album. That's when she found it. Evelyn opened the file on her tablet. It wasn't a prenuptial agreement. It was a blueprint. The one her own husband had designed. The one he had been working on in secret, on nights he'd claimed to be finalizing the museum expansion. A stunning seaside home in the Carmel, California. A masterpiece of glass and stone designed to feel, for the first time in her life, like a place she would never belong. It had been modified just 3 weeks ago. The initials on the title block, bottom right, were not hers. She recognized the confident stroke of his pen instantly, the precise angle of the J connecting to the V. Beside it, Anis and Anar. His handwriting, bold and clear, on a document he had called his legacy proposal. She remembered the evening he'd told her that. She had just come through a difficult second trimester and had finally been feeling better. Julian had brought the architectural drawings for the new museum wing to their dining table, along with a glass of sparkling cider. He'd said his lead attorney had already approved the updated partnership clauses. He'd said the board needed her signature before the quarterly meeting. He'd said it was just a formality. She had signed where his finger pointed. She had trusted him. "The SR, Ike," Evelyn said softly, "is for Sophie Russo. The files show he's also established a new limited liability company with her. In the event of a voluntary separation," she continued, "it transfers his majority shares in Vance Designs to this new entity. It liquidates your joint investment portfolio to fund it, leaving you a single lump sum payout described in the text as 4 years of spousal contribution." She named the figure. Ilara barely heard it. It also redefines the parameters of marital assets, Evelyn went on, in a way that excludes the intellectual property of all architectural designs created during the marriage, designs that, under your original agreement, would be considered shared property. The room was utterly silent. Chloe, sitting by the window, looked like she might shatter. Marcus was staring down at the city below. "He built it," Ilara said. It was not a question. It wasn't an accusation filled with anger. It was a flat, dead statement. The sound of a person who has reached a final truth and is simply hearing it in the air for the first time. "The timeline of the file creation," Evelyn said, "combined with a series of cash transfers to the new LLC that I uncovered this morning, suggest a highly organized pattern, a complete financial and personal restructuring in anticipation of a departure." "He built it," Ilara said again. Her voice hadn't risen, but it had changed. It had hardened, like clay fired in a kiln. Evelyn said, "The good news is, he was sloppy. You signed the partnership update under what clearly constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation. His claim that his attorney reviewed it is a lie. I spoke with his general counsel this morning. He has no knowledge of this document. He was never informed." She paused. "Furthermore, your father's investment records show that the seed funding for Vance Designs was personally guaranteed by Thorne Industries 10 years ago, long before your wedding," Marcus said from the window. "The guarantee is beside the point." "I know," Evelyn said. "Tell me what you require." "A 48-hour injunction, full access for my forensic team to his company servers, and Ilara's formal authorization to proceed." Both the lawyer and her father looked at her. She was holding the tablet, staring at the initials on the blueprint, written on an evening when she had felt tired and proud and trusting, and trying so desperately to be the kind of partner who never questioned his vision. She set the tablet down. "You have my authorization," she said. Evelyn nodded once. She closed the file. She walked toward the door. "Evelyn," Ilara said. She stopped. "The house, the company, the accounts." She took a breath. "How long has he been building this?" Evelyn was quiet for a second. "Based on the first draft of the Carmel blueprint," she said, "approximately 18 months. Ilara nodded once. The lawyer left. Chloe waited until the door was fully shut, then said with the gentle care of someone handling broken glass, choosing each word, "Ilara." "I know," Ilara said. I need you to know that I know, Laurie." Chloe crossed the room and took her sister's hand, holding it tight, saying nothing more because nothing more could be said, and she understood that. Marcus came away from the window. He sat in the chair on the other side of her bed. He put his hand over both of theirs, and the three of them sat together while the monitor kept its steady count and the gray Seattle light shifted against the wall. Ilara looked at the tablet on the windowsill. 18 months, she thought. 18 months of sharing a home, a future, a nursery plan with a man who had already started building a different life, just waiting for the right moment to move in. 18 months of her thinking they were a team, while he was secretly drafting her replacement. 18 months of her making herself smaller, more agreeable, and calling it a partnership. I erased myself, she thought. For 4 years, I made myself quieter, less demanding, more supportive, and I called it love. It wasn't love. I helped him discard me, and I told myself I was being a good partner. This wasn't self-pity. She knew the line between blaming herself and seeing the truth. She had walked over to the right side of that line in the last hour, and she was going to live there now. The baby shifted, a long, decisive roll from within, a movement that seemed to say, asterisk still here, we are both still here. Ilara laid a hand on her belly. I know, she whispered. We are going to be okay. She wasn't sure it was true, but she said it anyway because she knew in some deep part of her that some truths have to be spoken into existence to become real. For 5 minutes after that, she was alone. Marcus had gone into the hall to make a call. Chloe had gone to find a nurse. Dr. Ann Sharma had come in, checked the fetal monitor strip, and left with the composed, neutral face of a professional who sees more than she is permitted to speak about. The room was quiet. The monitor beeped its rhythm. The hospital's life filtered in, soft-soled shoes, a paging system, a low voice down the hall discussing dosages. She did not think about lawyers. She did not think about what would happen next. She just sat inside the reality of what she now knew, completely still, the way you have to stop moving entirely to finally understand your own location. She watched her child's heartbeat on the monitor. 144. Steady, sure, utterly its own. Across the city, Julian Vance's phone started buzzing. The first alert was from David Chen, his IT director of 10 years. * Julian, call me ASAP. There's a full admin lockout on the Thorn Museum server. The second was from his personal banker. The third was from his banker again, this time flagged as urgent. The fourth wasn't a message. It was a news alert from a Pacific Northwest business journal, a small headline that was just background static until the moment it became the only sound in the world. Thorn Industries announces comprehensive review of all third-party contracts, citing governance irregularities. Statement by CEO Marcus Thorn. Julian read the alert. He read it again. He called David. The Thorn servers are moving, David said. Someone is initiating a full data clone of the project archives and simultaneously, how much? Julian snapped. David told him. A pause of 4 seconds. 4 seconds was an eternity for Julian Vance to be silent. He said, have my car brought around. He arrived at Swedish Medical Center 25 minutes later. He had used those 25 minutes well. He had recalibrated. It was a skill he had perfected in a decade and a half of tense boardrooms, the swift analysis of a situation, the identification of what could still be manipulated, the creation of the right emotional state for the room he was about to walk into. He had also stopped at the high-end florist in the hospital lobby. The white orchids were breathtakingly expensive, their stems long and elegant, wrapped in rustling paper with a simple silk ribbon, the kind of arrangement that suggested both deep regret and the effortless grace with which that regret could be shown. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, the orchids in his left hand, his phone in his right, reading his banker's latest panic text about the Thorn credit lines. He slid the phone into his pocket as the doors opened. He walked down the corridor with the calm, measured stride of a man who believed he could design and build his way out of anything. He hadn't planned on finding Leo Vance in Suite 7B. He paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. Leo by the window, a slim portfolio at his side, Marcus in the armchair next to Elena's bed, and Elena herself, propped up against the pillows, her hands resting on her pregnant stomach with a stillness he didn't recognize, not in 5 years of marriage. He glanced down at the white lilies in his own hand. He entered, placed the flowers on a side table, and took his position at the foot of the bed. He remained standing. To sit would be to accept the room's current configuration as a given. Marcus, he began, his voice pitched with warmth and concern, the voice of a man arriving to manage a delicate family crisis. Julian, I'm glad you're both here. I was about to call you. Elena and we had a very stressful morning. I just want to ensure everyone understands the complete situation before we... What precisely is there to understand? Leo asked, his eyes fixed on a spreadsheet on the tablet in his hands. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Elena has been under enormous pressure, the bed rest, the pregnancy, the complications. It's taken a toll on both of us. We had a disagreement that got out of hand in a way that I deeply Julian. Elena's voice was quiet, steady, no apology, no hesitation. He turned to her. She said, "The cloud syncs to all our devices." The ensuing silence was thick, unyielding. Julian glanced at the small, polished screen of his own phone on the nightstand. He had been in this suite countless times over the last 4 days. Not once had he considered the permissions on their shared family storage account. He was certainly considering them now. She watched him process the implications. She had always known how quickly his mind worked. She'd once found that speed, that raw processing power, incredibly attractive. She watched him run the scenarios, tallying what could be salvaged, what was lost, and which narratives could still be spun. "Elena," he said, his voice shifting to a lower private key, the one he used across restaurant tables in the quiet of their penthouse, in all the spaces he had built for just the two of them. The voice she had once mistaken for love. "Whatever you think you found this morning." "We're not doing this," she stated. He froze. "Not another day," she said. "Not ever again." 5 years of marriage, and she had never strung those words together. Saying them cost her something fundamental, and in the second after they left her lips, she felt a different part of herself return, something small and solid that was entirely hers. Marcus stood. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he possessed an unnerving quality of absolute focus. When Marcus Thorne looked at something, it knew it was being seen. "This is what happens now," Marcus said, using the tone he reserved for boardrooms where fortunes were about to shift. "Leo filed an application for a protective order this afternoon. The financial records are indisputable. You will leave this suite. You will have no contact with Elena, direct or indirect. All future communication goes through Leo's firm." Julian said, "That is an over..." "Furthermore," Marcus continued, cutting him off, "Thorne Properties is invoking the termination clause on Ether Dynamics headquarters lease, effective immediately. The full penalty, 30 days. Formal notice will be couriered to your office by the close of business." Something flickered across Julian's face. Not fear, Julian Croft didn't do fear, but a seismic recalibration deeper than the first, one that reached into the very bedrock of his company. The lease, the morality clause his own lawyers had dismissed as standard boilerplate. The clause that had, 8 years ago, seemed like a minor concession for a landmark downtown tower lease from his future father-in-law, a symbol of family trust. He saw it for what it was now, a very long chain held by a very patient hand. "You can't," Julian said. "The terms don't permit a unilateral..." "The terms," Leo said, finally looking up, "include a morality clause requiring executive conduct that does not bring disrepute upon the tenant or the property's public standing. A chief executive officer embezzling corporate funds to purchase a $2 million penthouse for his executive assistant with digital records of the wire transfers. Our legal team is prepared to argue this constitutes conduct detrimental to public standing." A beat. "They feel very good about their chances," Leo added. Julian looked at Elena. She held his gaze. There was no victory in her eyes, no grief. She was something calmer and stronger than both. She was watching him the way you watch a hurricane from behind stormproof glass, fully aware of its destructive power, but no longer afraid of it. "I deserved better," she thought, the words forming with clarity inside her for the very first time. "I deserved so much better than this, from the moment we met." "You will regret this," Julian said. She replied, "I have more than enough regrets. This won't be one of them." He left. The door clicked shut. The white lilies sat on the table. No one touched them. They stood in their crisp paper, fragrant and expensive in the afternoon sun, already slowly starting to wilt. Sarah came through the door 30 seconds later. She had been waiting in the lounge down the hall. She placed 2 cups of coffee on the bedside table. She glanced at the lilies, then at Elena, then at Marcus, and asked in the measured voice of someone who has waited a very long time for an answer, "So, is it done?" Elena looked at her father, at Leo, who was already on his phone in the corner, then at Sarah. She said, "It's done." And for the first time since 9 this morning, she felt something besides cold shock. A tiny warmth, deep in her center, moving with the same quiet certainty as her child. It was hers. Sarah handed her the coffee. It was a little too bitter and had a little too much cream. Elena didn't say a word. She cupped the mug with both hands, letting the heat seep into her skin. In the parking garage across the street, Miles Grant was already on a call. Julian asked. He said, "Silverstream Ventures is following the Thorn position, and Redwood Capital just put their Series B funding under immediate review. This is spreading faster than kill the Omnicorp acquisition," Julian said. "The Omnicorp board is already seeing the chatter. They're going to want, just kill it, Miles." A pause. "Understood," Miles said. He hung up. He sat in his Tesla in the concrete garage, staring at the wall, thinking about 10 years, about all the things he'd noticed and decided weren't his business to question. He put the car in drive. He had a crisis to manage. Marcus Thorne didn't operate on emotion. He operated on architecture. He had built Thorne Properties over 30 years on 2 core beliefs: knowing what a thing was truly worth and having the patience to wait for the exact moment to act on that knowledge. He could wait longer than anyone dreamed and move faster than anyone believed. His entire empire was built in the gap between those 2 states. By the time Julian's car pulled up to the Ether Dynamics building, Thorne Properties had already released its formal statement to 3 major tech publications. It cited governance failures and a material breach of commercial leasing covenants. 2 of Marcus's top lawyers had spent the last 3 hours crafting it. It was airtight, it was legal, it said nothing about the affair or the money. It didn't have to. The story found its own life. The documents from Leo's office were, technically, private, but a sealed filing from a prominent family naming a high-profile tech CEO was subject to digital court records. An investigative journalist at TechCrunch saw the filing alert at 3:37 in the afternoon. She was good at her job. She made 5 calls. She confirmed 2 details and sourced the rest to an anonymous but verified source. 800 words. Precise. Devastating. By 5 p.m., it was the top story on the site. By 6, it was on Bloomberg. By 7, it had 50,000 search results. Julian's PR team issued a denial at 6:52. This is a private family issue being maliciously distorted by competitors using falsified information. The statement was quoted everywhere. The phrase private family issue, however, deployed while the family member in question was in a maternity ward on a cardiac monitor, did not have the intended effect. By 9 that night, the story had 200,000 search results. Elena was discharged at 4 o'clock. Her heart rate had stabilized. Dr. Chen checked the final monitor readouts, compared them to the alarming spikes from the past 82 hours, and noted the improvement in the careful, neutral language of medical charts as being subsequent to the removal of a significant external stressor. She paused at the door of Suite 7B and took Elena's hand. "I'll be here," she said, "for anything you or the baby need. Anything." Elena squeezed her hand, wanting to find the right words to thank her, but failing. She just nodded. Dr. Chen understood. Marcus drove her to the Thorne family's brownstone on the Gold Coast, the house where she had grown up. She saw it as they turned the corner. The glossy black door, the window boxes her mother had planted for 40 years, the warm light from the kitchen already glowing against the twilight. She sat in the passenger seat of her father's car model. She sat in the passenger seat for 5 minutes after her father cut the engine. She couldn't get out yet. It wasn't about feeling unsafe or unwilling. It was because the house behind the iron gate was the world from before, and the moment she stepped inside, everything would become after. She just needed a few more minutes in the quiet space between. Marcus sat beside her. He didn't say a word, didn't glance at his phone. He just occupied the space with her in the dark Chicago driveway, the way he had always sat with her through every hard thing in her life, simply present, a solid, unmovable fact. After 5 minutes, she finally opened the door. Isabel Serrano met them in the foyer. At 62, with her silver hair in an elegant chignon, she had the look of a woman who, after 40 years with Marcus Serrano, had perfected the art of assessing a catastrophe in a single glance. She saw her daughter's face and simply opened her arms. It was a complete embrace, silent and absolute. She smelled of Chanel and fresh espresso, and beneath it, that indefinable scent that had always meant home. Maya pressed her face into her mother's silk blouse and let herself completely unravel. It wasn't a loud or dramatic collapse. It was the silent kind of disintegration that happens when you've held your world together with nothing but the sheer force of your own will, and you finally arrive at the one place you no longer have to. Isabel just held her. She didn't rush it, didn't offer platitudes or promises that it would all be okay. She was too sharp and too honest to guarantee a future when her daughter was struggling to breathe in the present. She just held on. When it was over, they went to the kitchen. Isabel brewed tea. The kitchen smelled exactly as it had her entire life. The deep blue walls, the view of the rain-slicked garden through the bay window, a small plate of cheese and fruit on the marble island, the simple offering Isabel always made when one of her family needed something to anchor them. They sat. They didn't mention Julian. They didn't speak of legal strategies or financial entanglements. Instead, Isabel told a long, rambling story about a dispute with the Landmark Commission over a new downtown development. Maya almost smiled. It was close enough. Across town, things were different. In the conference room of Vance Architecture, the mood was sour. Julian Vance was there, along with his 3 senior partners, the head of PR, and his 2 top lawyers on a secure video link. It wasn't quite panic. Julian didn't tolerate panic, but it was the tense, charged atmosphere that comes when seasoned professionals know exactly how monumentally bad things are about to get. The news that Marcus Serrano was pulling funding from the Aria Tower project wasn't, by itself, a death blow. Vance Architecture had enough capital to weather the hit, and with some aggressive maneuvering, they could find new backers. What couldn't be managed was the implication. Serrano Properties doesn't just walk away from a flagship project without a very good reason. That was an ironclad rule in Chicago's development world. When Marcus Serrano cited a fundamental breach of professional trust and dissolved his partnership, other investors started asking questions. Not out of panic, but because they were professionals who knew Marcus Serrano's instincts had been flawless for 30 years. Questions led to calls, and calls led to formal reviews. By 10 that night, both the Omni Group and the Pritzker Endowment had announced a freeze on their joint ventures with Vance Architecture. By 11, the industry news feeds were buzzing. David, Julian's oldest partner, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Millennium Park. He thought about the 19 years he'd worked with Julian. He thought of all the design pitches where Julian had presented Maya's brilliant landscape concepts as his own. He thought of the small, consistent ways a man can subtly diminish his own wife in front of others. He remembered all the times he'd told himself it wasn't his business. He turned from the window. He spoke into the stunned silence, his voice flat with the calm of a man who has finally decided that keeping his job is less important than telling the truth. Julian, this isn't a PR problem. You need to think about what you actually did today. The room went dead still. Julian looked at David. The stare was cold, precise, and intended to convey a threat that needed no words. He said, "You're off the waterfront project, David." David picked up his leather portfolio from the back of his chair and his briefcase from the floor. He looked at Julian one last time with the weary expression of a man who has just put down a burden he's carried for far too long. "Fine," he said. He walked out. The door clicked shut. No one spoke. Julian turned back to the scale model of the Aria Tower. He picked up a craft knife to adjust a detail. He said, "We continue." His voice was perfectly level. His hand was perfectly steady, but the knife slipped, snapping a delicate balcony from the model's facade. It clattered to the floor. No one in the room moved or spoke because no one wanted to be the next person to point out something true. Miles away, in a Wicker Park apartment, a woman named Chloe sat on her couch, her laptop glowing in her lap. She was 28. She had been, or had believed herself to be. The grammar suddenly felt impossibly complicated. Julian Vance's girlfriend for 18 months. She knew he was married when they started. He'd explained it on their fourth date in a tone so reasonable it had seemed perfectly logical. The marriage was a business arrangement, emotionally over for years, just a matter of untangling complex finances. A partnership in name only. She had believed him. She had believed so many things. Now she reread the email chain she'd accidentally been copied on, the one between Julian and his lawyers. She thought about the furious phone call she'd overheard him on that afternoon when he'd left his office door ajar. "She'll get nothing," he'd snarled. "I'll prove she's an unstable wreck and get sole custody." Chloe stared at her laptop, at the files for the new Miami office he was putting her in charge of. A promotion, he'd called it. A new beginning for them. She looked at the budgets, the wire transfers, the shell corporation he'd had her sign the incorporation papers for. Some quiet, insistent part of her had known something was wrong, prompting her to save a copy of everything to a private drive. The rest of her hadn't been ready to see it. She sat with the truth for a very long time. Then she opened a new browser tab. She searched for the lead counsel for Serrano Properties, a lawyer named Elias Thorne she'd seen quoted in a trade journal. She found his direct line. She stared at the number for what felt like an hour. Then she dialed. Elias Thorne took the call at 10:15 that night. He was at his desk because Elias Thorne was always at his desk when the Serranos were making a move. He listened. He asked only 2 questions. He thanked Chloe, assured her she had done the right thing, and told her he would be in touch first thing in the morning. Then he called Marcus. Marcus called Maya. Maya was in the guest suite of her parents' home, the one that had been hers through college. It had the same pale yellow walls she'd once begged her mother to change and now found deeply comforting. She had slept, a profound and dreamless sleep, from midnight until 8. She had assumed she would spend the night wrestling with her own thoughts. Instead, her body had simply shut down, a wounded animal seeking shelter from a coming storm. She was sitting by the window watching the morning light hit Lake Michigan when her father called. Her mother was already in the garden below, pruning her rose bushes with the intense focus of someone nurturing things back to life. "That young woman, Chloe, she called Elias last night," Marcus said. Maya processed this. "What does she want?" Maya asked. "To help," he said after a brief pause. "Tell me," she said. And here is what Chloe had, compiled without ever understanding she was compiling it. 18 months of evidence, project files for the Miami satellite office that was, in fact, a shell corporation, with a timeline showing a massive transfer of assets set to finalize 1 week before Maya's due date. Emails between Julian and his personal attorney from over a year ago, strategizing the specific legal language that would frame Maya's decision to step back from the firm during her pregnancy as a pattern of emotional instability, and archived server chats in which Julian discussed his plan to sue for sole custody, arguing that her artistic temperament made her an unfit mother. He had been planning it all before their baby was even conceived. Elias read Maya the summary over the phone. He read it in a clear, steady voice with no emotion or commentary because he knew that what she needed most was the unvarnished truth. When he was done, she was silent for a long time. She looked down at the garden, at her mother's gloved hands moving surely among the thorny stems, tending to what was still alive. Then she asked, "Is she okay?" "The woman, Chloe." Elias said, "We've taken measures. She's safe." Maya nodded to herself. "He told her the marriage was over years ago," she said, less a question than a statement. "He told her he was waiting for the right time." "He would say that," Elias agreed. Then he paused. "She also asked me to tell you that she is profoundly sorry." Amelia held the phone, listening to the silence, the scent of rain, the dim Chicago light, her mother's hand on her shoulder. "Tell her I got the message," Amelia said finally, her voice steady. "And tell her, thank you." After hanging up, she remained in the guest room, the gray light filtering through the blinds. She allowed herself to feel the profound strangeness of it all. The woman who had shattered her life was now, by her own volition, offering a lifeline. It was a lesson in how grace can appear from the one direction you never thought to watch. She found her way downstairs to a kitchen filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the comforting hum of her mother's presence. Amelia took a seat by the window overlooking the small city garden, where wet leaves glistened. The rain was letting up, and a fragile brightness was returning to the world. She considered what she wanted, not as a strategy, not as a reaction, but simply what she truly desired, the way a person does when they finally stop trying to bend their own needs into a shape someone else will approve of. She wanted her son to be safe. She wanted him to know, from his very first breath, what safety felt like inside four walls. She wanted the nursery painted the color of Lake Michigan on a cloudy day. She wanted to hear her sister Chloe's laugh over the phone. She wanted Friday night pizza with her parents, coffee that was always strong and hot, and the distant, comforting rumble of the L train outside a window that belonged only to her. She wanted to reconnect with the version of herself that existed before Julian, the woman who had strong opinions about modern art, who spoke them confidently, and who never scanned the room afterward to gauge their reception. She believed that woman was still in there, just waiting. She had been quiet for a very long time. She felt she was ready to make some noise again. She sipped her coffee. That afternoon, Julian broke the restraining order. He called her cell at 11:14. She watched his name flash on the screen and let it ring. He called again at 11:19. She silenced it. At 11:22, a text appeared. "Amelia, we can't do this through lawyers. This is us. Please." She took a screenshot and forwarded it to Marcus. Then she placed her phone screen down on the counter and went into the garden to find her mother. Marcus called 40 minutes later. His voice had a specific edge she was coming to recognize. The sound of a litigator who has just been handed a beautifully wrapped gift. "He just handed us leverage, Amelia," Marcus said. "And for the first time since this whole mess began, *weary* in the driver's seat." She heard the word "we." She filed it away. "Tell me what happens now," she said. "Tomorrow," Marcus replied. "I have a meeting with the firm's independent counsel." 3 days after that, the senior partners of Croft and Associates convened an emergency meeting. Julian arrived at 7:58 for an 8 o'clock start, moving with the casual authority he brought to every important room. He was impeccably tailored, projecting an aura of certainty honed over a lifetime of being the most formidable person in any space. He carried a slim leather folio and wore a dark charcoal suit, the one he saved for situations where the outcome had to be bent to his will. He'd slept for 4 hours but looked like he'd had a full 8. He walked through the glass boardroom door and froze. The arrangement of the room was wrong. 3 senior partners he had always counted as his staunchest allies were sitting on the opposite side of the long table, far from their usual spots. They were positioned next to 2 of the firm's most conservative members, partners he'd never considered friendly. This new configuration had a certain shape, an undeniable message that a veteran of corporate politics would grasp in the first 3 seconds. It was the shape of a verdict already rendered, a meeting held not to argue a point, but to deliver a sentence. Julian Croft was a very experienced veteran. "David," he said to the managing partner, "what's going on?" David Chen was 71 years old, a man who had guided the firm through 4 decades of booms and busts. His face was a mask of neutrality, worn by someone who had navigated so many crises that he no longer found them exciting. "This is your partnership, Julian," he said calmly. "Have a seat." The meeting ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Julian commanded the floor for most of the first hour. He was poised, articulate, and surgically precise. He had come prepared. He framed the recent press coverage as a sensationalist attack based on incomplete facts. He painted Amelia's legal action as a painful family matter driven by a woman under immense emotional strain, not as a legitimate threat to the firm's stability. He insisted that taking a leave of absence would project weakness to clients and competitors who were already circling. The partners listened intently. The independent members asked pointed questions. Their inquiries were specific, referencing documents, internal expense reports, digital blueprints for an unbilled private residence, which the firm's counsel had acquired from the main server, the timeline of a recent amendment to his prenuptial agreement, and a shift in his life insurance policy beneficiary. They knew everything. About halfway through the second hour, Julian grasped that this information hadn't been collected in a panic. It had been meticulously compiled by professionals who knew exactly what to search for and had been given the full authority to do so. He knew then who had given that authority. At the end of 2 hours and 17 minutes, the partners voted 7-2, a mandatory, indefinite leave of absence, pending a complete forensic audit of all projects and internal accounts, to be handled by an outside agency. Sarah Jenkins was appointed interim managing director, effective immediately. A press release, drafted and vetted by legal teams, was slated to hit the wires at 4:15 that afternoon. Julian walked out of the boardroom at 4:23. He passed through the open-plan studio he had designed, a space that spanned 23 floors of the tower he had built, striding past assistants who suddenly found their keyboards fascinating and analysts who stared intently at their monitors. He went by the senior project managers who struggled with varying success to avoid his gaze. He walked to the elevator, rode it down, crossed the marble lobby, and pushed through the revolving glass doors onto the windy Chicago street. 2 photographers from prominent architecture journals were waiting on the pavement. They didn't chase him. They simply documented his hand rising to shield his face, his town car swerving a little too quickly to the curb, and the small, clumsy haste of a man who had built a career on controlling every last detail of how he was perceived, now leaving a building where he would never be the most powerful person again. Amelia saw none of it. She was on the floor of the spare bedroom in her parents' Lincoln Park house, assembling a bassinet. It had been delivered that morning, a gift from her sister Chloe, who had insisted that building something is better than breaking down. It was made of dark cherry wood with sleek lines and a modern curve. The instructions were a 28-page booklet that seemed to reference a completely different product, possibly manufactured on another planet. Chloe was helping. Her version of help involved sitting cross-legged on the rug, reading the instructions aloud in a series of increasingly absurd voices. First, a stuffy art critic, then a nasally documentary host, and finally, what she called a deeply exhausted Scandinavian designer. She consistently handed Amelia the wrong tool and declared, "I'm almost certain that piece is upside down," about parts that were clearly oriented correctly. But she was present, and she was making Amelia laugh. It wasn't the polite, managed laugh of cocktail parties and gallery openings, but the real thing, the kind that erupts from your very core and takes you by surprise. It was the most normal thing to happen in 5 days. It was the best thing to happen in 5 days. By 5:30, they had finished. The bassinet stood near the window, its dark wood glowing in the late-day sun. One leg was a millimeter shorter than the others, a permanent souvenir of the inscrutable Step 14, which neither of them had ever fully understood. But it was sturdy, it was sound, it was ready. Chloe stood back, hands on her hips, admiring their work. "We built that," she said, with the profound satisfaction of someone who has just conquered a great challenge. "You handed me the wrong hex wrench 4 times, Amelia pointed out. "I was providing morale in the form of incorrect tools. It's a very specific skill," Chloe retorted. Amelia gazed at the bassinet, at the dark wood and clean lines and its one tiny flaw. The baby gave a firm, deliberate kick against her ribs, a little hello to let her know he was awake, and had thoughts on the matter. Amelia placed her hand flat against her belly. Something shifted in her expression. A knot of tension she had carried for so long that she'd forgotten it was there began, almost invisibly, to loosen. Chloe saw it. She didn't say a word. She just came over and slipped an arm around Amelia's shoulders, and they stood there together, looking at the bassinet in the fading light. The thing they had made. The thing that was ready. Her father, Robert, appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He stood there taking in the scene, the room, the bassinet in the corner, the soft light on the dark wood. He was quiet for a long moment, possessed by the unique stillness of a man absorbing an emotion much stronger than he had anticipated. "Have you thought of a name for him?" he asked softly. The list Amelia had on her phone was gone, deleted 2 days before. Every name on it had been chosen in another lifetime, by another woman. She looked at the bassinet. "Michael," she said, "after my grandfather." Robert made a quiet sound, not quite a sob, but close. Nothing quite so grand, something more intimate and whole. He gave a single nod. He glanced at the bassinet for a second longer. "She'll love that," he commented. His tone measured deliberate, very much so that evening Ilara lay sleepless in their minimalist bedroom at 2 a.m. It wasn't fear, it wasn't panic. It was the specific alertness of a person standing on a precipice, feeling the approach of a great change without yet seeing its form. She thought of the encrypted file on the server project legacy. She thought of the trust document. With Chloe's name on page 3, she thought of Julian leaving for work, adjusting the collar of his bespoke shirt, and she thought of 5 years of making herself smaller, more agreeable, more compliant. And she thought about the tech gala where she had stopped correcting people about architectural history. She thought I was so terrified of who I was becoming in that life. I was afraid that if I stayed any longer, I would vanish completely, that there would be nothing left of me that was actually real. Then the other thought, the one that was growing stronger now, more solid each time it surfaced, but I became this person. Instead, she rested a hand on her stomach. Her son stirred beneath her touch, awake at 2 a.m. It seemed was a trait they already shared. She took a breath. She endured the asset protection trust was contested in probate court a month after the discovery. Marcus had assembled the case with the surgical precision he applied to everything. The digital security breaches were the opening gambit. The security expert who had supposedly audited Julian's personal server was a contractor paid by Ether's finance department, A truly independent audit, by definition, demands an independent auditor. The assertion that Ilara's own financial advisor had seen and approved the asset transfer was disproven by that advisor's own records, his meeting logs, his communications, and his sworn testimony that he had never been consulted about any such trust. The mischaracterization of the fund's purpose presented to a pregnant and exhausted Ilara as a simple tax optimization strategy was detailed in messages between Julian and his wealth manager about how to frame it. So that she would not be inclined to question the details, Julian's legal counsel was formidable, 2 senior partners from a top-tier Sand Hill Road firm with an army of associates. Marcus was simply better. The trust was frozen, pending a comprehensive forensic audit. Ilara's claims were filed under their original marital asset agreement. Those original terms, as it happened, were exceptionally fair, drafted by her own counsel 5 years prior, by a woman who had assumed the partnership was entered into in good faith. The Ether Board's emergency review happened in parallel. Its findings were delivered in the precise, passive voice of corporate governance reports concerning the forensic audit revealed significant unauthorized capital transfers. Julian's paid leave was made permanent. A negotiation commenced. It was quiet, protracted, conducted through several layers of legal representation. On one side, Julian's personal lawyers and the crisis management firm he'd hired on the other, the board's independent counsel, and from a distance, Marcus Thorne. The negotiation concluded after 11 days. Julian's resignation from Ether. Effective immediately, a severance package that was dramatically less than he had anticipated, and a non-disclosure agreement binding all parties. David Chen was appointed permanent chief executive officer pending shareholder approval. David Chen called Ilara himself to inform her he was concise and professional. Just before he hung up, he said, "I should have spoken up sooner. There were things I noticed over the last year that didn't feel right. I didn't act on them. I regret that." Ilara replied, "You spoke up when it counted. You walked into that boardroom when it counted. There was a pause. Thank you for that." He said, "I mean it," she replied. And she did. The venture capital investments were restructured, managed by a new firm, Ether stabilized under David's stewardship. Her father-in-law withdrew his support of Julian quietly. He never made a public statement about any of it. There was no need. Ilara found a flat in Pacific Heights. She found it with Sophia on a Wednesday morning in early spring, walking down streets she hadn't visited since before her marriage. She'd forgotten in 5 years of penthouses and Julian's minimalist aesthetic and the careful management of his world, that she had always adored this area, the painted ladies and the steep hills, and the way the fog rolled in during the late afternoon. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a restored Victorian on a quiet street. Tall ceilings, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that caught the afternoon sun, a view from the bay window that was not impressive by any standard definition, a shared garden, some rooftops the side of another building, but it was hers. She signed the papers. She painted the main room a color called eucalyptus mist. It was a soft, muted green. Her mother stood in the doorway of the half-finished room on the Saturday Ilara was painting and said, "That is almost the exact shade of your childhood bedroom back home." Ilara looked at the wall. "Really?" she asked. "Almost exactly." Helen confirmed. Neither of them mentioned it again. Some things didn't need to be analyzed. Some things were simply right and true and only needed to be witnessed. She put the bassinet together in the 2nd bedroom. The one she'd bought online that had a tiny scratch on one of its legs, she had thought about sending it back and decided against it. It was solid and it would serve its purpose. She had resolved as a general rule to stop demanding perfection in things that were good enough. She bought a chair for the corner, a deep blue wingback with soft fabric. She placed it by the window where the afternoon sun would hit. She sat in it for the first time on a Monday evening. Alone in the apartment, and looked at the room, she had made the bassinet, the chair, the soft green walls of the other room visible through the open door, the city noises drifting up from the street. She thought, "I made. This belongs to me." It wasn't a world-changing thought. It wasn't loud or victorious. It was a simple and complete and perfectly sufficient thought, and she held it carefully like the warm mug of tea in her mother's kitchen, and she let it be enough. She started seeing a therapist on a Tuesday. Dr. Anya Sharma was in her late 40s, pragmatic and sometimes wry. With that unique patience that comes from spending years with people navigating their worst moments, she never made Alara feel like a project. She didn't perform sympathy. She just listened and asked questions and sometimes said things that took a full week to unpack in their third session. She said, "What stands out to me is that you never stopped being capable. You just started acting like you weren't." Alara thought about that statement for 6 days. She thought about the tech gala, about falling silent on a topic that was her actual field of expertise, about the 5 years of practiced meekness. She thought, "I knew things. I always knew things. I just stopped trusting my own voice." In their 5th session, she said, "I need to find the woman I was before I met him." She was so sure of herself. She had theories, and she wasn't afraid to defend them. Dr. Sharma asked, "Where do you suppose she went?" Alara said she got very quiet, but I'm pretty sure she never left. Dr. Sharma said, "No, I don't believe she did either." Chloe sent an email. 3 paragraphs, concise and direct. Alara read it through one time at her small kitchen table on a Friday morning with her tea. When she was done, she archived it without replying. She never looked at it again, but she didn't delete it. Some things are meant to be kept. Even if you don't yet know why. On the phone with Sophia one night in May, Alara said, "You know what's been on my mind. I keep thinking about who I was before all this." She was so confident she had these strong ideas about everything, and she just put them out there. "What happened to the old you?" Maya asked, without waiting for an invitation. Amelia fell silent. "I kept shrinking my own dreams because it felt simpler," she finally said. "I convinced myself that was partnership, that I was being a supportive wife." After a beat, she added, "I'm going to get her back." Maya's voice was warm. "I don't think she ever left. She was just buried under all the excuses, waiting for you to stop apologizing for taking up space." Amelia let out a breath. "Yeah." The silence that followed was easy, full of understanding. "Yeah," she whispered again. On a Friday morning in September at 5:47 a.m., Amelia Reed gave birth to a son. The labor lasted 14 hours. Her sister, Olivia, was in the room the entire time. She was a calm anchor in the storm, a presence that asked for nothing. She offered water at the perfect moments, whispered encouragement when the waves of pain crested, and rested a steady hand on Amelia's back through the worst of it. She simply remained. She had done this before, in different rooms for others she cared for, and she knew that sometimes the whole job was just to bear witness. Maya had shown up at the hospital at 8. The night before, she arrived, armed with a tote bag that held 2 different kinds of protein bars, sparkling water and flat water. In case taste changed, a history monograph she had no intention of reading, but whose presence she found grounding, and a small knitted octopus from the hospital gift shop. She claimed the octopus was for the baby, but also for her own emotional stability, which Alara understood perfectly. She settled into the waiting room and sent text updates. They were all unfailingly positive. To utterly unraveled and with all avenues exhausted, Robert stalked the corridor. He moved with the caged energy of a man who had spent a lifetime presiding over outcomes, now faced with one he couldn't command. This is to say, he moved with immense purpose and zero tangible result. Back and forth across the polished linoleum of the maternity wing for 13 hours. The nurses learned his orbit, sidestepping him without a word, and brought him black coffee twice, unsolicited, which he accepted with the faintly startled appreciation of a man unused to being cared for. Julian wasn't there. Isla had known he wouldn't be. The restraining order remained firmly in place. The legal battle was churning forward. There were sound logical reasons for his absence. The emotional truth was far simpler. Lying in the birthing suite at 4 a.m, in that strange lucidity that can strike during the most grueling physical trials, she had a thought. There is no one in this room putting on a show. There is no one I have to placate. There is no one I need to shrink myself for. There was only the effort and the people who cherished her. And then a cry, high and clear and startled, as if Leo himself couldn't quite believe his own audacity. As if he had burst into the world and found it instantly astonishing and was compelled to register this fact at the fullest, most honest volume. Eleanor laughed, a sound that was whole and complete and instant. It was the laugh of a woman who has been waiting an eternity for a very specific sound and has at last heard it. And in the very next breath, she was weeping, openly and without shame, in that delivery room, the tears of someone who has clutched onto hope for so long and has just been granted the right to finally set it down. Eleanor Vance wept in that room and offered no apology for it, and it was among the most beautiful things Isla had ever witnessed. Robert was ushered in. He stood beside the bed, gazing at his grandson, so tiny, so flushed, and entirely unimpressed with his recent journey from an internal to an external reality, a fact he was communicating through a continuous vocal protest. His face did something Isla had never, in her 34 years of knowing him, ever seen it do. Every part of it softened. The entire structure built over decades, the judicial composure, the measured control of what he revealed and when, the meticulous construction of how Judge Robert Vance presented himself to the world, it all just fell away, completely and in a moment. He was simply a man gazing at a baby, which is likely the most ancient and straightforward thing a man can be. He whispered, "Hello, Leo." Leo did not reply. He had points to make, and they were not yet in words, but they were being made with great force. He had entered the world with very strong opinions, and he fully planned to voice them. Robert sank into the chair next to the bed and took his daughter's hand, his eyes fixed on his grandson, and his face remained open. And absolutely none of this needed to be managed. In the months that came after, Isla rebuilt, not with a single grand action, not in some dramatic montage, but in the slow, cumulative way that real life unfolds, incrementally, imperfectly, with setbacks showing up at the most inconvenient times and breakthroughs that came without warning and didn't always appear to be breakthroughs at first glance. She went back to architecture in February when Leo was 4 months old, not to Thorn Developments, but to a boutique firm she started with 2 colleagues from her days before Julian, women she had drifted away from during her marriage. The drift had been so slow she hadn't even realized it was happening until she was already miles from their shore. When she finally called them, with the hesitant energy of someone unsure of the reception she'd find, they were just there, immediately, without needing any explanation for the distance. The firm's first year was solid. The second was even better. She attended therapy every Thursday. Over the months, she noticed she was discussing different subjects with Dr. Sharma, not the urgent matters, the documentation, the heartbreak, the angry reckonings, but the quieter topics, who she was evolving into, what she envisioned for the next 10 years, the version of herself she was constructing, which was not identical to the one that existed before, because you cannot navigate something like this and emerge on the other side unchanged. And she had finally stopped trying to. She wasn't the exact same person she was before Julian. She was someone who had survived something. She was someone who had learned lessons she never would have chosen to learn. She was someone whose contours had been shaped by hardship rather than by design. She was, she realized one Thursday afternoon in Dr. Sharma's peaceful office, more completely herself than she had ever been. She didn't date, not that year, not yet. She knew that not yet was a reference to time and not a permanent condition, and she was careful not to confuse the two. The Lincoln Park brownstone, over many months, became entirely her own, in the way only the passage of time can make a place yours. She learned which window captured the morning sun and which one held the afternoon glow. She knew the pour-over coffee was perfect if you let it bloom for precisely 40 seconds. She learned that Leo, in his slightly crooked crib, slept most soundly with the white noise machine on its lowest setting and the hall light casting a thin sliver under his door. She knew these things the way you know the things that are truly, authentically, completely yours. Robert and Eleanor came for Sunday dinners. These visits, over the months, became the rhythm she used to measure her weeks. The soft gray walls of her parents' kitchen, her mother's cooking, and Robert in the armchair by the bay window, holding Leo with a practiced ease that suggested he'd been doing it for a lifetime instead of just a few months. Leo recognized his voice early, the way babies recognize the things that have been a source of constant warmth and presence. He would turn his head toward the sound of Robert entering the house, toward that unique frequency of Judge Robert Vance's voice saying his name. He brought it up just once, very quietly, and only to Eleanor as they sat in the kitchen after Isla had left one Sunday night. "He knows my voice," Eleanor said. "Of course he does, my love." He said nothing more on the subject. He just accepted it, the way you accept the things that finally come to you after a very, very long wait. On a Thursday morning in December, 8 months after the hospital, Isla Vance sat at the dining table in her Lincoln Park brownstone and sipped coffee that was absolutely perfect. Leo was in his wooden high chair, the slightly imperfect one she'd bought specifically because it reminded her of his crib, because she had made a quiet decision in the autumn to embrace things that were almost right. He was inspecting a slice of avocado with the intense focus of a biologist making a groundbreaking discovery. The morning light filtered through the dining room window in a specific way. It slanted in at an angle that caught the deep blue of the living room wall through the doorway and made it seem to glow from within. It was a beautiful light. It was a light she had learned to see and to feel thankful for in the simple daily manner of a person who has made a conscious choice to notice good things when they appear. Her phone was on the table. She didn't look at it. She hadn't looked at it in the first 15 minutes of her day, which was a claim she couldn't have made for most of the last 4 years. She hadn't checked it 3 times, lock, unlock, desperate for a message from a man who measured out contact based on what precise level of anxiety would keep her most obedient. She hadn't checked it once. It remained on the table, screen down, and she left it there. Leo glanced up from his avocado. He looked at his mother. He had his grandmother's eyes, which were Eleanor Vance's eyes, the color of a stormy lake just before the rain. He had Isla's mouth, which meant he had an expressive mouth and a lot of opinions he wanted to share with it. He placed the avocado back on his tray. He reached out his tiny hand. He laid it flat against Isla's cheek, gently. The way small hands touch things that are important, with curiosity and absolute sincerity and zero performance. The way someone who hasn't yet been taught that the world wants you to hide your needs touches the face of the person who is, for now, their entire world. Isla closed her eyes. She felt the small, warm pressure of her son's hand on her face, the same cheek, the same face that had once been touched with violence and was now being touched with love. And she knew, with her eyes shut in the morning light, that this was what healing really was. Not the dramatic moment, not the victory in a courtroom or the triumphant pitch in a boardroom or a stock price moving in the right direction. This ordinary, completely perfect morning. She thought about the penthouse design suite, the hum of the plotter printing schematics while her husband critiqued her choice of marble, the cold, sickening shock of it, her hand rising slowly to her face. She thought about her car parked on the street, the 4 minutes she had needed before she could walk into the new apartment, into the place that was safe. The chasm between the woman she had been walking out of that architect's office and the one sitting here now. She thought about the prenuptial agreement and the 2 years of deliberate planning, the careful, methodical demolition of her financial independence by a man she had trusted with her entire life. She thought about assembling the crib on the floor with her friends, reading the instructions aloud in silly voices. She thought about the 3 a.m. vigils, sitting in the chair beside the not-quite-perfect crib in the deep blue room. She thought about Dr. Sharma saying, "You never lost your talent. You just started believing it wasn't your turn to use it." In the 9 days she'd been repeating that phrase to herself, she thought about her mentor's steady gaze over a video call. She thought about her sister striding down the hospital hallway, already on a mission before Amelia had even finished asking. She realized the blueprints had been there all along. She thought, "I just needed one devastating smart speaker recording to finally give myself permission to build." Leo pressed his tiny hand more firmly against his mother's face, insistent, present, and completely here. Amelia opened her eyes. Her son was staring at her with those brand new navy blue eyes, direct and curious, entirely unapologetic for demanding her attention. Amelia smiled. It wasn't the practiced, placating smile she had perfected for tech galas and tense investor dinners, the one used for the long, careful navigation of a powerful man's ego. It was the other kind, the one that bubbles up from a place you can't name and appears on your face without a single thought. Leo, seemingly content with this response, turned his focus back to a soft piece of avocado. Amelia reached for her coffee. Outside the window, Seattle was starting its day. The specific symphony of the city began to build. The low hum of traffic, the cry of gulls, and the far-off, ordinary sounds of people moving toward the places their lives required them to be. It was the sound of a world that didn't need her to be smaller, that didn't require her approval or her performance. A world that was just moving forward and had a space in it for her. She sat there with her coffee and her son in the morning glow. She thought about Maya, who would text at some point today because Maya texted every single day with the consistency of someone who knew that being present isn't about grand gestures, but about practice. She thought about the Sunday video call with her mentor, with David in his leather chair by the window and his bookshelves stretching to the ceiling, a reliable source of wisdom. She thought about her new architectural firm and the client meeting she had on Wednesday afternoon, and the bold proposal she had drafted late on Monday night, after Leo had fallen asleep. She had been sitting at her small desk, the city lights twinkling outside, her own expertise flowing from her mind onto the screen. She was articulating what she knew directly onto a blank page, without once wondering if the ideas were welcome. She thought, I found her. The version of herself she had lost, the confident one, the one with daring ideas, the one who put her vision on paper. She wasn't exactly the same as the person who existed before Julian. She was someone new, forged by all of it, by the love she had offered so freely and the trust she had placed so foolishly, and by the 4 years and the tech company and the digital recording on a cloud server and the crib and the 3 a.m. feedings and the sage green walls and the coffee that was, at long last, dependably and perfectly brewed. She was constructed from all of it, and she was more completely herself than she had ever been. The baby thumped his little fist against the high chair's tray. This was a new skill. Leo had formed strong views on the appropriate speed of avocado delivery and was prepared to communicate them. I hear you, Amelia said. She stood up. She sliced another piece of avocado and placed it on his tray. Leo inspected it and, apparently satisfied, picked it up. The morning unfolded. The light streamed through the window, catching the soft green of the wall, and everything in the apartment felt warm and normal and, most importantly, theirs. The coffee cooled to the perfect temperature. The city carried on its business beyond the glass. Leo continued his serious research into the textural properties of avocado, and Amelia Reed sat in the middle of the life she was building, the one she'd designed, the one she had drafted from the raw materials of an incredibly painful year, and allowed herself to be fully, quietly, and completely present within it. Starting over, she had realized, was nothing like the picture people painted. It wasn't a single triumphant moment. It wasn't the day the divorce papers were finalized, or the day the story about Julian's affair hit the tech blogs, or the day he walked out of the gleaming headquarters he would never lead again. It looked like this: coffee and morning light and a son with his father's dark hair, thumping his fist on a bamboo tray, with the absolute certainty of a person who had never been taught to want things quietly. It looked like staying. It looked like being right here, in this normal morning, completely yourself, with no act to maintain and no one's feelings to manage but your own and your child's. No smaller, more convenient version of yourself was needed. It looked like this. Exactly like this. Closing disclaimer. This narrative was thoughtfully researched, created, and manually refined by our team with the express purpose of conveying meaningful emotional truths and resonant life lessons to our community. Each narrative is designed to affirm that your journey is significant, your resilience is profound, and the final chapter is always yours to write.